boy howdy, do I have something exciting for you today. You might have heard about the Harvard plagiarism scandal that recently happened. The Harvard president evidently plagiarized a ton of stuff, and so she was fired. And you might also know that something we have discussed in the past is in the Christian sphere, particularly in the Southern Baptist Convention, which is the largest Protestant denomination in the world, the previous president, who is named Ed Litton, is kind of notorious for having plagiarized upwards of around 120 sermons, like point by point in very many cases. So it's not just the fact that he didn't cite the things that's the problem, but the problem is more primarily that he is not actually preaching to his congregation. He's reading something that another pastor preached to his congregation. And what makes this even worse is that Ed Litton even told stories that other pastors actually had happened to them as if it happened to him. So it's like not only plagiarism, but straight up lying is what Ed Litton was guilty of. And because of the Harvard incident, this event has kind of been brought to light again, and people are questioning, why wasn't Ed Litton disciplined at all? And they're asking the current president of the SBC this, named Bart Barber. And Bart Barber is a popular character on this podcast. So if you want to know more about Bart Barber's foibles, you can look him up in my show, and you'll be able to find a lot more content. But as I've said before, the SBC is an endless stream of content. So here's more. So basically what happened on Twitter was this all started by a fella named Michael Linton. And Michael Linton said, totally plagiarized at Bart Barber this morning on my sermon. Hashtag not sorry. Obviously making fun of the people who think plagiarism is bad. And so Bart Barber responds, and somebody else, Tim Rogers here, says, yeah, let's make jokes out of plagiarism so we can cover for the person that agrees with us. But let's make mincemeat out of a man that stands for truth when someone spreads lies about him. That is now the SBC way. And then Bart Barber posts some dumb, childish gif. And then Tim Rogers here replies and says, tell me, with the smirk emoji, how seriously plagiarism is taken. It's a pretty serious item in the secular world, but in the SBC, we just let it go if it is someone that advances our agenda. So basically, he's saying, if someone's like, if you like someone, you're not going to punish him. That's not fair. Like, God hates unequal weights and measures, right? And so here's how Bart Barber responds. The rest of this conversation is fascinating. It goes into, it's an absolute rabbit trail, but based on the other videos I've done, you guys enjoy me covering this kind of stuff, so let's dive in. Bart Barber says, kind of sarcastically, sure, Tim, since your kind isn't already made up, or since your mind, he meant to say mind, but I guess Bart Barber doesn't read his tweets before he hits post. He says, sure, Tim, since your mind isn't already made up, and since you're looking for good edifying conversation on Twitter with a friend this morning, he's being sarcastic. Plagiarism is taken very seriously in academic institutions of higher education, both within and without, and outside of the SBC. In third grade, on TikTok, and in every Sunday school classroom on the planet yesterday, SBC and beyond alike, it's not a concern at all, yesterday being Sunday, at the time of this being written. So Bart Barber was saying, plagiarism is a big deal, but in Sunday school rooms, it's not a big deal. Now, we're not talking about a Sunday school room, remember, we're talking about a pulpit, which is very different. However, but also, like I said at the beginning of the episode, the plagiarism itself isn't the issue. I kind of wish people wouldn't talk about plagiarism. To me, it's kind of a euphemism. Like, the real issue with Ed Litton is that he lied. Like, what I would do is I would focus on the stories that he told as if they happened to him that other pastor shared. Yes, it's plagiarism, but even worse, I mean, it's like blatant lying. So that's the thing that I would focus on, but most people, they just accuse Ed Litton of being a plagiarist and not a chronic liar. So that's what we're going with. And Bart Barber is doing a very clear straw man here, where he's saying he's diverting this to Sunday school classrooms, and not, pulpits, and not pastors preaching another man's sermon to his congregation. Because, a pastor's job is to preach to his congregation what he thinks they need to hear, not preach to his congregation what another pastor thinks his congregation needs to hear, right? So Bart Barber continues. He says, "Can I go through 2 years of recordings of every Sunday school class at your church? Would I find anything that had been used by anyone without attribution? Would you then remove them from teaching Sunday school and practice church discipline on them?" Now again, I think this is the consequence of us using plagiarism as the issue for Ed Litton. Yes, he plagiarized. Yes, plagiarism is an issue. But the kind of plagiarism that he did isn't just saying something without referencing it, right? Like, it's the amount of plagiarism that's the problem. So Bart Barber is actually latching on to this idea of plagiarism, and he's running with it. And so he's trying to make this Tim Rogers guy look absolutely ridiculous for thinking plagiarism in church is a bad thing, because, I mean, it happens all the time. Like, churches just wouldn't exist if we couldn't quote other people's work, right? Says Bart Barber. So he goes on and says, plagiarism by all of us is either taken seriously or treated as no big deal, depending on the context in which it takes place. Is preaching more like being a university professor or more like being a Sunday school teacher? That's the question. Now, I think that's a very interesting question. And like I said, Bart Barber is latching on to this idea of plagiarism. And he's basically saying plagiarism is actually okay in certain contexts, and it's not okay in other contexts. So, and then he says, and it's one for which I'm happy to have a good faith conversation with a friend. Now, it kind of sounds like Tim Rogers and Bart Barber, they know each other. They have some kind of history. And it almost sounds like maybe Tim Rogers is a volunteer, maybe a Sunday school teacher himself. I don't know. But he says, Tim Rogers here replies, "Bart, if a Sunday school teacher were president of the SBC and you went through every sermon for 2 years, I would be in the group for pushing for it. But that isn't the issue. The issue is you said you would look over Litton because of the alternative to his resignation." And so Bart Barber replies, he says, "So, trying to keep up here, A, it only matters for the SBC president, but B, that the thing you pounced on me about this morning is actually not an issue?" Tim Rogers says, "Plagiarism matters for everything and everyone. Had Pastor Mike Stone won the election and it came out he plagiarized like Litton, I would be at the front for calling him to step down. That is my biblical-based conviction, and the same ones though my friends had." Something there was mistyped. Bart replies, "The idea that plagiarism matters in your third grader's essay on kinds of puppies or your Sunday school teacher's lesson on the Sermons on the Mount is just ridiculous. I think too highly of you to believe that you really believe that." Tim Rogers replies, "So Bart, they clearly know each other. They've got some kind of history. So Bart, it seems like you're going to take this to the absurdity level." Here's where the conversation starts to get really good, I think, where some of the stuff under the surface is starting to come out. "Seems like you're going to take this to the absurdity level, Bart. You want me to respond with proof from an antinomian's perspective. And now you have accused me of puppies in the third grade." I can see this convo is going to be deciphered based on your perspective only. Good day. Then Bart says, 1, it's not antinomianism. Antinomianism basically means people who hate the law, people who want to ignore the law. It's like the opposite of legalism in theological terms. Bart says it's not antinomianism or hatred of the law to say that you've applied the wrong law in the wrong place. Number 2, pointing out the absurdity of your comment is not actually an absurd thing to do. Bart says, I have no problems letting the thread stand as it is and letting readers decide for themselves who made the most sense. This is a huge mistake because now podcasters like me are going to be able to jump on this, and reporters like Megan Basham, actually, who's getting involved, is going to be able to comment on this. Typically, I think like kind of big shots and elite types, they don't comment. They don't get into arguments on Twitter, usually. And there's a reason for that. Usually because they say really stupid stuff and people can comment on it. So Bart Barber has a history of being a big fat moron, honestly. And I mean, this is he's continuing the trend. So this is awesome. A lot of good content here. He says, but I will leave this up for the readers because I believe Tim to be a good man and a good pastor. Here's what I think happened here. I'm not sure that my friend Tim appreciates the difference between cheating and plagiarism. We're not talking about cheating. We're talking about plagiarism. Tim is saying plagiarism is always wrong. The thing that Sunday school teachers do is not plagiarism. Now, Bart is going to describe later what, like in more context, what this thing is, quote unquote, that Sunday school teachers do. And it's going to be fascinating. But basically, Tim's argument here sounds like what Sunday school teachers do is not plagiarism, but yes, plagiarism is always a bad thing. It's essentially lying. It's stealing, taking somebody else's work and pretending it's your own. Now, if there is a common knowledge that you're going to be sharing things that's not yours, or like quoting the Bible or whatever, you don't necessarily have to cite every single thing you say. In fact, every idea we have is not a new idea. Like, everything we have is just a combination of things that we've learned from other people or other things through our whole lives. And so in one sense, like you could use that to argue that, like, well, everything's plagiarized, except plagiarism is a very specific kind of thing. And I think Tim obviously recognizes that. Bart is trying to use this ridiculous reductio to try to prove that no, plagiarism is okay, depending on the context, when Tim is saying, no, plagiarism is never okay, right? Bart says, cheating is wrong. Remember, this guy's the president of the Southern Baptist Convention, right? Cheating is wrong and is taken seriously at all levels of academic work, but the context of your work defines what constitutes cheating. That third grade essay on kinds of puppies I mentioned, you copied another student's paper. That's both cheating and plagiarism. Trouble. But if you copied large blocks of text out of Encyclopedia Britannica or off of AKC's website, that's plagiarism, even in the third grade. But it's not cheating. So now Bart seems like he's kind of saying, like, plagiarism is never wrong, but it's just illegal in certain academic contexts. Is that what he's saying? Because that's weird, because plagiarism kind of by definition is stealing. And I don't know, according to the 10 Commandments, stealing is wrong. But plagiarism is a very different thing, again, from just quoting people, right? It's hugely different. They're two totally different things. What Ed Litton did was not only plagiarism, but it was lying. That's why I wish we would focus on the lying thing. And Megan Basham, in a tweet thread that she started, actually called this out. Like, the plagiarism was bad, but the thing that really gets me is the pretending to tell stories about yourself that never happened that somebody else told. Bart Barber, though, on this kind of trail that he's going down, he's making sense. Like, he has a logical argument. I think he's just building a straw man. This isn't actually what we're talking about. So he goes on, Bart Barber. What a silly name, Bart Barber. We also talked about Dusty Devers, who got into it with Bart Barber. A lot of funny names in the elite echelons of the SBC. Anyway, he says, copying from a book or a website or encyclopedia is actually what your third grader wants you to do in that assignment. What your third grade teacher wants you to do in that assignment. They haven't even started to teach you about citing sources. They just want you to learn to do some basic research and writing. I don't understand how this is relevant at all. He says the trail life trailman who uses a Duralite log on his Fire Ranger test is cheating. Weird. The same boy who does that to start a backyard campfire on Thanksgiving Day is just being smart. So I understand Bart Barber is saying it depends on the context, except now he's talking about cheating and not plagiarism. So I think Bart is kind of like mixing his metaphors here. It's kind of hard to follow. It looks like maybe he typed all these very quickly back to back. He says, whenever you are writing a PhD dissertation, copying material from anywhere without full attribution is plagiarism and cheating, and is justification for denying you the degree and for expelling you. For a Sunday school teacher, I'd far rather you plagiarize someone's commentary in your class than that you offer your own original but heretical riff on a topic like the Trinity. So this is interesting. This is another like massive straw man. Bart Barber is not saying plagiarism is good here, but he's saying plagiarizing faithful commentary is better than heresy. But nobody's disagreeing with that. Like, this is the definition of a straw man, coming from the most, the highest member of the largest Christian denomination in the world. Think about that. He says, we didn't ask you to teach the junior high Sunday school class because we thought you were ready to write a commentary for B&H. We hoped and expected you would teach material someone else had prepared. So it's not cheating for you to plagiarize in that context. Except, Bart, that is not plagiarism. To follow someone's curriculum is not plagiarism. That's not what plagiarism is, you dummy. Golly. Now, he says, after all, you're a volunteer and you may be very well new to this. So, like, Bart is totally talking down to this poor guy. Sounds like this guy's a volunteer at Bart Barber's church, and who knows. Now, what's preaching more like? It's more like the dissertation. Or is it more like the dissertation or more like the Sunday school teacher? I think it depends. And I think it depends in the ways that actually may not be terribly helpful for Ed Linton. Oh, interesting. So why don't we discipline him? I think it matters whether you're being paid by people whose expectation is that you're creating original content. I think it matters at the level in which you're working. So again, Bart is kind of missing the purpose of a pastor. So like, is Bart saying, I mean, he's totally saying it's entirely acceptable, 100% it's acceptable for a church to hire a pastor who exclusively preaches other people's sermons. That's not okay. That should not happen. A church should not hire somebody with that expectation. But Bart's like, yeah, you have a church that does that? Cool, good for them. He says, some of the preachers who were involved in my first hearing of the gospel were preachers who used quite a bit of sword of the Lord material without attribution. I don't much care. That's different. That's not plagiarism, Bart. It's not what we're talking about. This whole conversation's a straw man. They were paid next to nothing at a little country church. Most of them had very little training. They faithfully pointed me to the gospel. I'm willing to cut them some slack on their study and attribution habits, especially since it wasn't cheating. That little church, the thing is, Ed Linton was cheating. He was cheating. He was cheating his congregation. He was cheating himself. He was cheating against his paycheck. He was cheating God. He was stealing other people's stories, and he was lying. That's like 3 different commandments being broken, you know? But for my part, I get paid a lot more than they do, says Bart Barber. I've gotten probably more education than is good for me. That is the truest thing that he said. And I think my congregation rightfully expects original content out of me. Plagiarism would be cheating for me. So was it for Ed Linton? The whole purpose of this conversation is to say, why isn't Ed Linton disciplined? Or what are you going to do about it? Bart says, Ed's situation is probably more like mine than like the Bethabara Baptist Church in the 1970s. A lot of this is kind of like inside stuff probably between Bart and Tim, so we're probably not supposed to understand everything that's going on. but it's a very revelatory discussion regardless. He says, but that's in his role as pastor of the church. As SBC president, he's not paid for that. And the SBC doesn't even require that the president be a preacher at all. An SBC president has not broken the terms of office by using someone else's sermon material. That doesn't make sense. Oh, it's so stupid. I don't want to explain why that doesn't make sense. But I will. If Ed Litton is a pastor and he has these expectations put on him by his church, that those expectations all of a sudden disappear whenever he preaches a sermon to the entire SBC, does he have lower expectations when he preaches a sermon to the entire SBC, or does he have higher expectations? Not only that, but he broke these expectations in his own church, which seemingly kind of, I mean, if he's not like qualified to be a pastor in his own church, and he is guilty of lying and stealing and cheating. Now, I don't know what the qualifications are for becoming the president of the SBC, but it seems to me like if somebody hires somebody or elects somebody to be the president of the SBC, there should be some like very, very menial biblical guidelines for how somebody ought to conduct themselves. Like, I don't know, perhaps the same that is expected of elders. And I don't think Ed Litton meets those expectations. I don't think Ed Litton, based on his behavior, is qualified to be an elder. I don't think Bart Barber, by his behavior, is qualified to be an elder. Tim Rogers, he comes back and replies, okay, Bart, what has the SBC president broken if he violates his marital vows? That is an awesome question. Yes. So Tim Rogers, he did the same thing I did, where he's pointing out the inconsistency in Bart Barber's argument. He's saying, so Bart, can an SBC president still be in good standing with the SBC if he gets divorced? So that's not a requirement to be the president of the SBC, but shouldn't we discipline somebody for doing that? You would think. Bart Barber says, transgressed the BF and M in every one of those cases. Baptist faith and message. So Tim Rogers says, what if he violates his marital vows, violates the moral law by breaking into a jewelry store, robbing candy at Walmart, etc.? So Bart says, well, that transgresses the Baptist faith and message. Now notice, I notice this a lot in the Baptist conventions, and they do this on purpose. They very intentionally, they don't point to scripture, but they point to the Baptist faith and message. I don't like that. But Tim Rogers says, so, and plagiarism doesn't transgress the Baptist faith and message? Now, Tim Rogers should say lying. He should say cheating. Ed Litton did those things. Ed Litton didn't just plagiarize in Bart Barber's sense of the word, but he did much worse. Bart replies, I can show you specific wording from the Baptist faith and message for all those things, and will do so if you require it. Oh, so humble. What a good guy Bart Barber is. You show me the wording in the Baptist faith and message about preaching material someone else preached first. That's so sneaky. That is like snakish language. That is so manipulative. Tim says, and Bart, therein lies the difference in our position. Yours is nuanced to hold the Baptist faith and message above Scripture. I like this Tim guy. We're on the same wavelength. While I can't find a verse, thou shalt not plagiarize, I can certainly find, let your yea be yea and your nay nay. Nay nay. Matthew 5:37, let your yes be yes and let your no be no. That verse is on communication. Bart says there's not a single verse in the Bible about how to cite sources. So Bart now he's changing the goalposts again. He's like, all plagiarism is about citing sources. That's all plagiarism is about. There's not a single verse in the Bible about citing sources. I wish Tim would push on the lying thing, the telling stories that didn't happen to him thing. But Bart kind of has a really nice bunker that he can slither back into to protect himself and protect his elite buddy, Ed Litton. Unfortunately. Here is the best part of the whole conversation. This is the climax. This is what it's all been building up to. This that I'm about to read, that Bart Barber says, is an insane theological claim. Get ready. Bart says there's not a single verse in the Bible about how to cite sources. The synoptic gospels don't cite each other. Mark's gospel is Peter's account, given without any attribution at all. So in other words, Bart Barber is saying Mark plagiarized Peter when he wrote Mark. Okay. Bart says, plagiarism is an academic standard that wasn't even invented until centuries after the Bible had already been written. It is a man-made protocol of how to indicate the sources of published academic work. Tim says, Bart, I honestly don't think we need to hold God responsible for plagiarism. If I remember correctly, the scripture is God-breathed and not man-copied. Tim's got a good point. Bart says, well, now it's both, isn't it? Do you deny that Mark's gospel is Peter's account offered without attribution? The point you've just made is simply that God inspired Mark to plagiarize Peter, which wasn't sinful, which didn't accomplish his holiness. Why? Because plagiarism is a man-made standard invented centuries later. It's not sinful in and of itself. There we go. There's the key. There's the admission. Plagiarism is not bad. It is not bad to steal. It is not bad to lie in the context of preaching sermons. Check that out. Bart Barber, the president of the SBC, is saying it is not wrong to steal and lie if you're preaching. Because that is plagiarism, and plagiarism is man-made. Therefore, lying and stealing in these contexts is not wrong. The question is, did Peter steal, or did Mark steal from Peter when he wrote the Gospels? Was Mark writing the Gospels for his own glory? When people plagiarize, when Ed Litton plagiarizes, and his job is to preach sermons that he works on, that he suffers for. Now, he didn't do this. But when a preacher spends weeks preparing sermons and writing sermons and thinking about all of the people in their congregation and thinking about their sins and thinking about their family situations and thinking about the troubles they're going through and the successes and their job situations, and he writes a sermon biblically expositing the text with them in mind and applying it to each and every one of their lives. That's the job of a pastor. And if he doesn't do that, he is actually not only stealing other people's material, but he's stealing a good sermon from every single one of the members of his congregation. Plagiarism isn't the end here. It's stealing and it's lying, especially the lying thing, I think is the most obvious point here. But what Ed Litton did was wrong. And what Bart Barber is doing, defending Ed Litton, is wrong too. It is not okay for a pastor who is supposed to be shepherding his congregation and spending time writing a sermon that should be for the edification of the specific lives of his congregation, not somebody else's congregation, but his. And he steals somebody else's work that was meant to be written for the edification, possibly, of their congregation. He's doing something seriously wrong. It is a grievous error of a pastor, I believe, for him to do that. And it's what Bart Barber is defending. So he says plagiarism is man-made. It's invented centuries later. It's not sinful. It's only sinful if you're bound by some sort of obligation to an authority who requires you to do your work by this man-made standard. Now, this is like another totally misunderstanding about like obeying authority. Like, plagiarism is only wrong if an authority says it is. That's a ridiculous point. We've covered like resistance to tyranny and godly authority and those kinds of things in other episodes of the podcast that you can look up and listen to. But basically what Bart Barber's just said is so stupid. Like, if you work for a boss and your boss says don't plagiarize, and you do, that's a sin. It's not a sin. You're just breaking what your boss told you to do. You can disobey authority and not sin. You can disobey authority and sin, but you can disobey authority and not sin. And in the case of something that's not a sin, if you disobey your boss, you're not sinning necessarily. So here we go. Bart says, Mark was not bound by any such authority. He plagiarized as God inspired him to. There you go. So Mark was a plagiarist. The authors of the Word of God are plagiarists, and plagiarism is not wrong. It's only wrong if you go to a school that says it's wrong. I'm gonna just scroll through these comments so that you can see how much people hate these stupid opinions. Somebody shared the definition of plagiarism. It says, the practice of taking someone else's work and ideas and passing them off as one's own. Did Mark do that? Did Mark take Peter's ideas and pass them off as his own? Or is he just sharing a story about the life of Jesus Christ? Mark also, I mean, there's no attribution, sure, but it also doesn't say like, I'm Mark and this is my original story. What? Like, do the authors of any book in the Bible, whenever they quote a person, are they plagiarizing those words? Whenever they say, Jesus said this, are they plagiarizing Jesus? I mean, they're citing Jesus, but jeez. What about the people who say things that they don't cite? This is embarrassing, and this is the president of the Southern Baptist Convention, and I am super glad he didn't delete this comment thread. You can go view it yourself until he decides to delete it. I have taken screenshots, of course, and I'm also going to be posting this on retake.church in the next few days probably, so you can check it out there as this continues to blow up. So probably nothing's going to happen at all, but what should happen is that Ed Litton's disciplined, Bart Barber's kicked out, and the SBC goes conservative, but they're not. That's not what's going to happen. The SBC is just going to continue on this trajectory. The elites who are in power and who are the ones who are responsible for kicking out the other elites in power, they're all buddies. Everything's just going to continue the way it's been going. And, hey, we get to talk about it. So that's fun. Hey, if you made it this far, please give the show a follow or a like or a subscribe, whatever you can, because the more or comment, the more you engage with the show, the more people are likely to see it. So help this uncompromised biblical content be shared with more people. I'll catch you next time. God bless.